Hello and welcome to the Celtic Way morning briefing. We're back today. We're joined by Graeme McGarry. How's it going, Graeme?
Good, thanks, mate. Yourself?
Aye, not too bad, not too bad. We'll maybe get to matters on the pitch shortly, but there's only one real place to start the day, I would think, Graeme, and that's with matters off the pitch. Celtic held their AGM yesterday, and shall we say it was a bit of a stormy one. You were there covering it. You were there covering it, of course. So, what's your biggest takeaway from it?
I guess the kind of biggest takeaway is that, there's a massive sort of gap between the board and the fans still. It was kind of obvious from maybe midway through last season, maybe before that, that maybe accentuated it a wee bit. But, certainly from yesterday, you could see, the differences in opinion and, many subjects from the shareholders who were there putting questions to the board, and from the board's responses, you could see that they're quite entrenched in their views as well, So, I guess my main takeaway was, even though maybe Ange Postecoglou's appointment has gone some way to kind of bringing the fans a bit closer to the club again, and he's doing a lot of good work in that regard, I think there is still a massive difference between the views of the fans and, the views of the board.
Dermot Desmond, once again, not in attendance. I don't know if that even came as a surprise, but it did draw a few giggles from the crowd, and I don't know if it was maybe one of those, if you don't laugh, you'll cry moments.
Aye, when Ian Bankier offered Dermot's apologies for not being there, that's when the crowd sort of, they're used to hearing that now. I can't remember the last one he was at, his son was there, obviously, and obviously his votes as well were certainly felt on the day, because, even the 4 resolutions that were voted down in the room were, carried in the end by the proxy votes. So, all in all, I think there's a lot of kind of disgruntled punters, I would say. Last season, I think, has left a really kind of bitter taste for a lot of people. You've got the kind of, obviously, the controversial rumoured appointment of Bernard Higgins, which it didn't exactly get cold water poured on it, I wouldn't have said, from the board's point of view, despite, protests from the floor. Other topics like, the European failures, weren't really kind of explained away either, So I think the board have got a lot of kind of making up to do. What I would say, in fairness, I think Michael Nicholson, in his first AGM since taking over for Dom Mackay, did well. I think he came across, quite composed. He's quite articulate, and I think his points that he made chimed better with the room than maybe the chairman's did. And the chairman perhaps is the one who came out of this maybe losing a few points with the public, let's just say. A wee bit aloof, a wee bit kind of surprised, I think, by the kind of strength of feeling from supporters about how things are going and how things have went in the last 12 months. So, all in all, it was an eventful day, I've got to say. And, I think, I don't know if it served the purpose of bringing in anyone closer together at all, really, to be honest.
In terms of what you said there about Bankier, if he actually genuinely was surprised, then does that not just elucidate a wee bit better that he maybe hasn't been necessarily paying attention to fan sentiment for quite some time then, if he's actually surprised that these things are getting brought up and brought up to him specifically?
Yeah, I think you're probably right there. There was no surprise to anyone in the room that these topics were getting mentioned. The very first topic was Bernard Higgins. You knew that was going to be the case. Following on from that, things like obviously the European stuff, the last season, how poorly it went. All these things were obvious points to make, and he genuinely seemed surprised that some of them came up. There was a lot of cries from the floor of shameful, their failures. There was calls for them to step down. But as you say, the main accusation was you're out of touch. And there was a moment where Bankier said, you just don't understand. Things are done behind closed doors. That's the way Celtic do it. And, that's just not going to wash with Celtic supporters. The big thing they're accusing them of is keeping them in the dark, and to actually admit that, was really quite strange. And then obviously he tried to win the room back a wee bit by kind of having a broadside at the Scottish Government for, the suspension. And listen, that's a bone of contention for Celtic supporters. Of course it is. However, the room had an answer to that. They said, well, what did you do about it? And he said, well, what do you want me to do? Take them on? And it was kind of like panto season, they're all shouting, yes, of course. So I just didn't see any kind of, there was no symbiosis between what was going on the floor and the point of view especially from Ian Bankier, I think, and I think he struck the wrong tone, and there was no conciliatory kind of tone from the chairman, and I think probably a lot of people left shaking their heads at what they'd just seen.
Speaking of striking the wrong tone, you've mentioned them a couple of times there. The Bernard Higgins mooted appointment, because as far as we're aware, it is still just reported. It's not a given. But perhaps speaking again to the fact that they don't speak enough to the fans, that there's not enough transparency. Surely the fact that the board still refuses to speak one way or the other about it is essentially a microcosm of the problem of the wider kind of mistrust. And to me, that suggests that the mistrust that I mentioned between a lot of fans and the board runs deeper than, for instance, I've seen a few people suggesting it's just because Celtic didn't have a good season and failed to get to 10. Surely this is yet another example that it does run a wee bit deeper than that. And what I would ask is why they're even giving themselves this headache, if you know what I mean, for a role that presumably has quite a lot of people that would be qualified for it.
Yeah, I don't really understand it myself, I've got to say. I mean, the protests from the Green Brigade, I'm always careful not to take that as a kind of, a sign of what the opinion of the broad Celtic support is. But certainly the strength of feeling from the floor yesterday about the appointment of Bernard Higgins, there can be no doubt that this is something that the Celtic fans just do not want. And I think that's pretty much across the board. But I compare the situation yesterday to when you're asking a manager about a transfer. If they're not interested, they'll tell you they're not interested. And if there is a bit of interest there, they'll say, well, we're looking at a number of players and we like the guy, but we're not going to comment on other clubs' players, that sort of thing. That was the sort of response that Bankier gave to that topic. When it was said, a fan very kind of passionately got up and said, you cannot appoint this man because he's so distrusted by the Celtic support. He had a bad effect on the mental health of a lot of young supporters back in 2012, in his role with Police Scotland. And the response was, I'm not going to give any assurances today. This is an operational role. He didn't deny it. He didn't admit it, which to me suggests there's at least something in it. And I think probably discussions have taken place. But surely, a blind man can see that if this appointment does take place, there's going to be more trouble for them. There's going to be protests. Fans are not going to like it. And as you say, I think it's just a unnecessary distraction from, what the managers try to do on the pitch and the way the club actually should be heading.
We've got a comment here, which, I mean, is spot on in the sense that is exactly the way it works. Even when supporters vote against something, the board have enough shares and then the proxy votes and stuff to do what they want. And that is true, but surely there's still something to be said for the people going to the AGM, making their feelings known, making it obvious that the sentiment doesn't lie with some of the decisions that the board have made previously or are possibly in the process of making. Surely it still makes, or it should still make, some sort of difference.
Well, the one thing the board can't say now, if they were unaware of the depth the support are feeling about these subjects and their own performance, they're certainly aware of it now, because I did see a few shareholders were walking out yesterday shaking their heads saying, what's the point? Because this will just be voted down. And that's the way it turned out, But I mean, it was so emphatic in the room when it came to voting down the resolutions to reappoint Bankier and obviously Brian Wilson as well. That got carried eventually, but at least the board know now, there's mass dissatisfaction with their performance and the way that, the board are actually handling things at the moment. And then obviously resolutions 11 and 12, which were voted for in the room emphatically. I mean, it's unscientific, but I would say just from looking, probably over 90% of people voted for that. And it was voted against, obviously, by the board. But I think the board now, if they were unaware and if they were out of touch, at least now the fans can say, we've made our feelings known, and you can see that there is that depth of feeling there. And, I think there's only so long the board can ignore that kind of thing and vote against the wishes of the supporters. How long they can get away with it? Well, some people might argue they've been getting away with it for about 9 years, but, when things are going well on the pitch, these things don't seem to, come up so much. And I think the board are kind of relying on things turning around to maybe distract fans. But I think on this occasion, the fans are so dissatisfied that, I don't even think if Ange delivered the treble that, the board would get off the hook.
I think you could argue that is where, as I say, it's not necessarily just the fact that they fail on the pitch or success on the pitch. There's there's still a mistrust there between a lot of the fans. Again, you mentioned not necessarily all the fans, but a lot of the fans and the board and the kind of strategic decisions that they're making. But I mean, you mentioned Michael Nicholson as well, and I suppose it is good that he mentioned specifically that everyone that he works with and stuff is pulling in the same direction and regards what's best for the club. But the problem I see with that statement, and this comes back to again the kind of transparency issue, is that by the board's own acknowledgement later on, pretty much everything is done behind closed doors. So the executives could virtually be doing anything or nothing in there, and who knows until the decisions are made and the effects of those decisions are being felt, which is why, or some of the reasons why, that you end up with this mistrust.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. You know, as well as Michael Nicholson did come across, and I think he was probably, you know, the most sort of composed of the board members there on the day. Yeah, that mistrust is going to be there because Bankier actually said at the end of the question about Bernard Higgins, he said, when we're ready to announce it, we'll announce it. So, you know, that suggests, you know, we're going to do what we want from our point of view, and actually the views of the fans maybe don't mean nothing, but they mean very little, or they'll have very little effect on the decision that they actually come to in the end. And it was curious as well, you know, there wasn't a mention of Dom Mackay, not once. In fact, Ian Bankier made a point of saying that Ange Postecoglou was a Peter Lawwell appointment, you know, which is kind of contrary to what they said before. And also, you know, there was no mention of Neil Lennon either, which is strange. You know, tributes were paid to Scott Brown, Bertie Auld, obviously, as well, which was probably the one moment where the whole room came together. And, you know, everything was a wee bit curious. You know, there was just things that nothing really went the way that the room wanted it to go, and there was just such a kind of atmosphere of, you know, distrust and negativity around the place when actually things are going so well on the park at the moment. And I think that the point you make about, you know, the difference between when things are going well on the park and when, you know, that there's still that mistrust of the board came when a lot of the people who did stand up congratulated Ange, who was there, obviously, you know, a penny for his thoughts about what was going on. But everybody congratulated him and everybody reiterated they were behind him. But, you know, the board members, they certainly weren't behind them. So, yeah, if I had to sum it up, I would say not the best day for the board. And, you know, it didn't really reconcile any of the kind of feelings that the Celtic fans have about them at the moment.
On the pitch matters. I mean, this is strictly still off the pitch, but it is good that the club is generally still in good health financially. You can take that from the AGM as well. I'm sure, if nothing else, that the potential automatic Champions League money for the league winners this season would surely be of enough strategic interest to strengthen adequately in January, or so you'd hope.
Yeah, I mean, I think when there was a question about the sort of the January transfer window and more generally the sort of scouting setup and the sort of the structure of the club when it comes to transfers and things like that, you know, and it was Michael Nicholson that fielded that one. And he said, you know, they'll be fully behind Ange in the January window, and I think there will be funds to do that. You know, Ange has already identified there must be, I think, probably 4 or 5 players are going to come in the January window. There's certainly areas of the squad he feels need strengthened. But we'll see. You know, Michael Nicholson obviously said yesterday that they'll back Ange and they'll give him what he needs. I think the summer window was pretty successful in that regard. You know, the players that have come in have done well. It was a wee bit, you know, last minute and a little bit, you know, slapdash, but they got there in the end. And hopefully, you know, if what Michael Nicholson's saying is true and there's a bit more planning went into this January window, then, you know, the 4 or 5 boys who will come in will be ready to hit the ground running.
I think what you mentioned there is that they got there in the end. That is kind of the, as much as they did that, I agree that they've ended up with more hits than missed probably from the transfers from the summer, but it's probably that kind of sums it up, that they got there in the end. And I think that's almost the attitude that I think the club is perceived to have had the last few years, that it was as long as they stay kind of one step ahead of Rangers, then everything will be all right, it's fine. That kind of thing, as opposed to aiming to be a proper a Champions League equipped club. I'm not saying they need to go and qualify from the groups of the Champions League every year or anything like that, but a Champions League equipped club where it's not scrimping about to try and get the players in for the qualifiers every year or wait until the qualifiers are done. So there's almost that kind of aspect to it as well, when you wonder, was it hit and miss just because it's just essentially winning a watch with some of them? that kind of thing. But it does bode well, as you say, that they've kind of alluded to, and Ange has alluded to more than once, that they've had things in place for the January window in advance rather than doing it as and when, that kind of thing.
Yeah, the January window has to be a time when you're not just looking at your final push for the title. You've got to be looking at the Champions League. I mean, this year's obviously a wee bit different in terms of Celtic will go straight into the groups if they win the title. But they've got to be thinking about, ahead to next season. They can't be, a situation last year where a team like FC Midtjylland puts Celtic out of the Champions League. Now, Celtic can buy and sell FC Midtjylland at any point. They're a massive club compared to Midtjylland. That should not happen. If it does, it should be a one-off. That was another thing yesterday that I think kind of annoyed a few punters, is that Brian Keir said, in a one-off game, if the players aren't giving you 100%, anyone can beat anyone. But then he also contradictory kind of said, teams are buying and selling us in the Champions League. That's why we can't get into it. Well, the two things can't really be true. And Celtic get knocked out, 6 years out of 8 in Champions League qualifiers by smaller clubs. So it all came from a lack of planning in January and looking ahead to the qualifiers. And what Ange was forced to go into in that game over in Midtjylland, no disrespect to guys like Dane Murray, but you can't be getting into crucial games with kids out the academy playing in key positions. It's ludicrous for a club of Celtic stature. So hopefully, that message has kind of got through. And I think, the January window's got to be somewhere where you're looking strategically, not just at the next 4 or 5 months, but at the next, 1-2 years.
Yeah. I think back when the transfer window shut, I kind of done an analysis looking at the signings and had they been backed, and spoiler, the conclusion was not really, kind of, but not really. And I pointed out that January, not next summer, but January window needs to be like the phase 2 of the rebuild. It can't be really just skated over and hope that you get the Champions League money and stuff like that. And I think that's even more true now, that we've had a run where there's been squad depth issues with injuries and different things like that. I think that reinforces that. But one part that I think gives me a wee bit of positivity is the fact that there's obviously heavy rumours and reports that he's going to be looking at the Japan market.
Yeah.
And the fact that their season's coming to an end and it might be, so we say, cost effective to actually get people in from there at this juncture rather than waiting until the summer, where they obviously, when they got Kyogo, that maybe gives me a wee bit of confidence that it is actually going to be making business sense as much as anything else to do it now, do it in January, sorry. But if we move on, Frank Brennan here, he's a regular viewer. He makes a point whether Desmond was at the AGM or not, it's no bearing on whether they beat St Johnstone on Saturday. So with that in mind, we'll try and do a wee couple of minutes on not necessarily the St Johnstone game itself, but Celtic had a fair few players away on international duty. They seem to have got through it pretty much unscathed, unlike the September window, which wreaked absolute havoc for basically until the October window. So how do you think they're shaping up ahead of this? Because it is a big game, massive game for Ange, massive game for the club.
I think they're looking good. As you say, Ange, I think he said after the September window, going into the October one, he was turning his phone off and lighting a candle and saying a few prayers, when his players went away. But it seems as if it's worked because the players have come back this time. And you think of the Scotland boys, Callum McGregor especially, who, absolutely phenomenal for Scotland the other night. And he kind of goes unnoticed. I think maybe like a lot of people talk about Billy Gilmore and obviously John McGinn, who grabbed the headlines. But I think more people are starting to realise that Callum McGregor's the kind of beating heart of that in there as well. He's been fantastic for Scotland. Great boost for Anthony Ralston as well to get a run out. I know it was late on and it was at left back, but that's where he should be. His form merits it, and I think I think he'll take a real boost for that as well. So, yeah, I think Ange will be quite happy. The only thing I would say is, these, especially guys like Callum McGregor, and we all know the concerns over Kyogo with burnout. But Callum as well, he's playing a lot of football. 90 minutes twice for Scotland there, I think, with the international break. And it's just as important to Scotland as it is to Celtic, I get that. But, certainly I think they'll maybe be looking to pull him out of 1 or 2 games early if they get the opportunity. But you know what he's like, he can play 60, 65 games a season anyway, which he's done for the last...
He only gets a rest when he's injured, that's literally it. That's the only time he's ever not on the pitch, really. But
I genuinely think for 2 years he only got 1 week off. I think that was right. So it's incredible what he's managing to do. But he's so key to Celtic, so Ange will be delighted that he's come through that unscathed.
With Kyogo, I noticed he get 16 minutes versus Vietnam, and then he get half an hour against Oman. So for him, it's not necessarily the game time; it's probably the travelling. You would think that would maybe wreak havoc with him. But I think probably all right to start. You would think it wouldn't pose any problems unless he got an issue that nobody knows about just yet. But with a comment in there asking about Rogic, Starfelt, and Julien, I think Julien's not, as far as I'm aware, not anywhere near ready for this. But the other two, is there any suggestion Rogic in particular might be ready, or is it still going to be a wee while yet?
Well, Ange told us just before the international break that the weekend between was going to be key for both those boys. So we've got another briefing with them today at 1:00. So hopefully we'll get a kind of definitive answer on that. But he was certainly confident prior to the international break that both Rogic and Starfelt would be available for the semi-final. These things can pick up wee niggles, and you just don't know behind the scenes. So hopefully stay tuned to the website today, and we'll get a wee update later on.
Last one is, and this is a good point, because obviously the Starfelt injury led to Stephen Welsh getting back into the starting 11. He did come off. I think he played 85 minutes and then come off. I don't think the knock was that bad. I think it was more precautionary. They were 2-0 down already and stuff, but he did play the full 90 for the Scotland under-21s against Kazakhstan. As I said, the Belgium game, he was 85 and then off. Both games were in Dundee, so there was no travelling involved or anything. And despite the fact they played essentially 2 full matches, same as you were saying about McGregor, in a way it's almost the opposite from McGregor, where it's maybe a benefit that he's played 2 full matches, obviously, because he wasn't getting much game time in the first team before Starfelt's injury. Yeah,
I think it's a good thing for Stephen to get a few minutes in his legs. He came in obviously the last couple of games and did well, and as far as I know, the knock's not too serious, so he should be fit. Again, we'll clarify that with Ange later, but certainly, at the time from the Scotland camp, he didn't seem overly concerned about it when we asked, so I think he should be okay.
Nice one. Well, on that slightly positive note, we'll leave it there for the day. Thanks for your contribution, Graeme. Remember, if you're watching on YouTube, to hit that subscribe button, and thanks for all your comments. We'll see you tomorrow.